Lecture 12, July 9, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session we examined the relationship between scientific methodology and the matter itself, and I tried, if I may just recapitulate, to give you a more concrete idea of the thesis that the fetishization of methodology replaces insight into the matter by showing, or at least formulating the general train of thought, which one should obviously not consider solid proof, for such proof must be very detailed, that the attempt to create a form of conceptual continuum in the so-called human sciences for the sake of a unified method can only fail. Now, it goes without saying that this does not do away with the problem of method, and I think that, after stirring things up, as it were, I must now see to it that you do not isolate the motifs I have presented, and that you do not misunderstand me by supposing that I wanted to throw method as such on the scrap heap. Initially, after all, method simply means that one makes the forms of logic the forms that have crystallized in logic itself, that is, the forms of correct concept formation, of adequate judgment and, above all, of the correctly drawn conclusion, into general principles, not only of the individual insights gained in these logical forms but also of demands aimed at knowledge as a whole, or at the ideal of science. For, because science or knowledge is impossible without thought, it is self-evident that the forms in which thought takes place remain valid as much for the aforementioned individual logical operations as for the overall context. Without that, thought would genuinely regress to mere arbitrary reaction, the mere spontaneous idea, Einfall, or what Kant, in a passage where he polemicizes against Aristotle of all people, who was certainly methodical enough and from whom the entire cult of method essentially originated, terms rhapsodic thinking. Point 1. Such a regression must be avoided, for it would actually mean that the thought would stop being a thought at all. Now, this motif is very often misused, especially in the usual view of science, to denigrate every isolated, or unconnected, as the logical positivists have become accustomed to terming it, insight simply because it carries the flaw of this rhapsodic, pre-logical and pre-methodical quality within itself. I certainly do not deny that such completely arbitrary insights exist, but I think the mistake that is made here is that the unconnected appearance of these insights, that is, the mode of their acquisition, the way in which they appear, is equated too easily with their objective structure, their truth content. I would say that, for a thinking that is in control of itself, that genuinely shows it is worthy of the name both in itself and in the matters it deals with, the so-called spontaneous ideas, which we are always told cannot be learned, are not the present from heaven, which they have always been imagined as by the theories of intuition too in particular, or, on the other hand, through their defamation by theories of science. Rather, in general, when one has an idea, it is often a case of thought processes that began unconsciously, far in advance, suddenly rising to the surface and becoming visible, in the same way a body of water sometimes does. And I would actually say that a thinking fundamentally shows its quality, its carat value, in whether the unintentional element is genuinely unintentional or, rather, represents the unity of the intentional and the unintentional within itself, that is, whether it possesses that quality of the spontaneity of the suddenly emergent, yet still results from an unconscious continuity. So I would almost say that, the more intensive a way of thinking is, the more emphatically one thinks about something, the greater the chance, if I might once again put it in very vulgar, almost materialistic terms, that one will have an idea, that is, the spontaneous ideas could then be considered the fruits of these thoughts that continue working underground, not aware of themselves at all. Without this aspect of the suddenly and unconsciously emergent, which generally tends to be the new quality of a thought, there can be no such thing as productive thinking. On the other hand, if it is not present in this continuity, it is entirely worthless. But it seems to me that, wherever these so-called sudden ideas are truly of significant weight, they have stored up the power of unconsciously continuing thought processes inside themselves. So, in other words, there is something like a unity between a thinking that is methodical and controlled by logic and that other aspect which, on its subjective side, I have characterized as the spontaneous idea, and which one might perhaps better refer to in its objective quality as the abruptly emergent contextual component of insight. Nonetheless, I think that the reflections we have undertaken do not invalidate or devalue method as such, but they do circumscribe it in a particular sense. There is a distinction in the critique of pure reason, which, to be completely honest, I viewed for many years, decades in fact, as an entirely superficial distinction, a distinction that was due merely to the overall architecture, something which is indeed quite abundant in Kant's critique of reason, namely, the distinction between so-called formal logic and transcendental logic. For one could dismiss this distinction as superficial with the very concrete objection that, for Kant, the unity of the entire system lies in the concept of reason, and that reason, and thus logic, is always the same, which means that the basic categories of reason must always be the same too. And indeed Kant himself emphasized this by essentially using the same arrangement for purely logical categories and categories referring to objects. In keeping with this reflection, then, one might say that there is something artificial and unconvincing about this entire distinction. In reality, however, and here I am also giving you a pointer as to how you might read Kant fruitfully, and will try to shorten the path for you that I myself had to take before, after many decades, I truly began to understand Kant at all, to understand what experiences, what spiritual experiences lie beneath the surface of his critique of reason. There is actually a very substantial difference here, namely whether thinking genuinely refers to other things or keeps to itself. And the profound insight that Kant had here, and, I would say, an insight that contradicts his own doctrine of reason but which should be highlighted all the more because he discovered it precisely in relation to the construction of his total philosophy, seems to me that the character of reason itself changes according to how reason, in its progress, is substantially dominated by its own mechanism, that is, by formal logic expanded into a method, or whether this progress of reason confronts itself with the aspects of things, with that to which it refers, when it is not remotely clear a priori whether it actually follows these rules of logic and their expansion into a method. I do not know if I have succeeded in expressing this correctly. If one looks at the prevailing scientific logic, whose content I demonstrated to you in the last session using Parsons as an example, then one can say that there is naturally also a certain connection between the method, or the expanded formal logic, and the objective things, insofar as the formally logical categories and the methodological demands, for example the unity of methodological progress or the minimum number of concepts to be used in the given case, then become the organizing principle for the objects. But, and this is seemingly a mere nuance, ladies and gentlemen, philosophy is such that the greatest things are located in the nuances, and that therefore the devil is in the detail, and only in the details. It makes a difference, a decisive difference, albeit a mere nuance, whether the laws of formal logic and method are imposed on experiences as an ordering principle or whether their validity, their applicability, is constantly confronted with what the things themselves are saying. So, to return to what I laid out for you in the last session, and to make it fruitful, if possible, for the considerations at which we have now arrived, the demand of formal logic and method is that of freedom from contradictions. Now it makes a decisive difference whether one applies this demand for complete consistency simply to the organization of the material tel qual, without regard for the specific character of the material as such, or whether one suspends this concern for consistency where it transpires that the phenomena themselves are as contradictory as I have attempted to show you, and that individual human existence and social human existence contradict each other. But logic and method gain honor nonetheless, for it has an obligation in turn to grasp this difference, this logical contradiction, this inapplicability of identically fixed categories to a manifold material, methodically and logically, that is, to find, as far as possible, a common perspective from which this illogicality itself becomes comprehensible again. If you ask me what I actually mean by method here, and probably the question will occur to many of you after this lecture, then I would say method means precisely that, on the one hand, 1. The illogical or anti-logical, contradictory elements of reality, that is, one does not directly order them according to the categories of formal logic, but that, on the other hand, one does seek thinkingly to grasp these contradictions or deviations from formal logic. And when I speak of seeking to grasp them thinkingly, this refers us to a form of higher freedom from contradictions, because we are so bound up in the mechanism of our own thinking, much as a rhinoceros is bound up in the cumbersome growths and armor that surround it, and from which it simply cannot escape. Now, we ourselves are a little like such rhinos or armored dinosaurs, and perhaps this very aspect is an archaic aspect of us, perhaps we will one day manage to emerge from it. One could probably say that such attempts, for example the theory of relativity or modern quantum mechanics, are attempts at such an escape from this rhinoceros armor. But, as long as we are still inside it, we have no choice but to incorporate the contradictions that come about between the thinking and the facts, into thinking once more, that is, at least to integrate them into the thought in such a way that these contradictions appear as part of reality but do not constitute the simple contradictoriness of the thought itself. And if dialectical philosophy has placed such value on the concept of totality or unity, I should say here that this is not simply the principle of identity gone wild, running amok, thinking it can subject everything in existence to its dictate, the dictate of the conceptual mechanism. Rather, it also dictates that, on the one hand, thought is not fully absorbed by the facts and the facts are not fully absorbed by thought, but, on the other hand, thought itself, as logical thought, does not actually permit anything except an attempt to reconcile the two. And the attempt to master this very deep, by no means easily resolvable paradox, this attempt was made by dialectical philosophy, and I would say that this is actually what the specific significance of theory should be today. So, in other words, theory requires self-reflection in the sense that it neither dispenses with logical unity, in the sense of the merely arbitrary registering of individual experiences or observations, nor dogmatically presents the order of thoughts as the order of things themselves, as done in early rationalism and most classically by Spinoza, who literally taught that the order of things and the order of ideas are the same, but, rather, subjects these two aspects to constant reflection. As strange as it may seem, it is precisely this reflection that has essentially been absent from the realm of method and theory in general, with the one, still exemplary exception of Hegel, I must say, and if I had to name the aspect of thought or theory that is not naive, that is scientific in a higher sense than the naive execution of mental and observational operations, then I would say it consists precisely in this reflection which I have tried to show you. But what makes this so difficult is that the idea of the absolute primacy of method is deeply tied to the idea of prima philosophia. It is no coincidence that, in Descartes, The idea of a rational philosophy elaborated from the cogito, from thought, is directly linked to the idea of methodological unity. Historically, if I may just touch on this, the need for method in order to progress from the simpler to the complex, and thus to understand the simple as the foundation and the complex as its consequence, goes back to the need for didactics, the need for teaching, in a specific sense, to the teaching method of the Pandects. 3. The teaching method in which Roman law was represented as a system, even though the tension between the need for didactics and the need to express the matter itself is already evident in the two versions of Pr. T. Uja, first being, in Aristotle, in the Metaphysics of Aristotle. For he also states there that in the didactic sense, the sense of the construction of a doctrine, that which is directly given, the sensual intuitions, is the while, proceeding from a reflection on the matter itself, he considers the uppermost metaphysical essences or categories to be this. In social reality, however, to move slightly away from these very speculative thoughts, it is by no means the case that the complex can always be directly explained by the simple. Capitalism is not simple at all. Capitalism is something extremely complicated and extremely complex, and anyone who thinks they can reduce it to its simplest and most coherent concepts for the sake of a method, and understand the world from that perspective, is actually falsifying the real state of things for the sake of a structure of representation, for the sake of didacticism, for the sake of doctrine. The demand for a method is not, or rather not only, an extension of the demands of formal logic to the whole of a science or the whole of scientific operations and procedures. Rather, because the method becomes independent and then, having already taken on a life of its own, is projected back, transferred back onto the oppositions, it comes from the fact that the matter is supposed to reveal itself through the supposed final preconditions of thought, namely the basic logical principles. When it is far from certain, far from clear, whether they are applicable to the matter. In that sense, the famous methodical thinking, in comparison to rhapsodic or aphoristic thinking, is the very last thing it wants to be, for it is dogmatic in a certain sense because it moves away from the matter and back into subjective reason. One might say that the notion of an absolute first thing is a fiction, and if, in the light of the things we have examined today, you make the effort to read the 10 or 12 pages of the introduction to Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the introduction, not the preface, then you will find that essentially, beneath the casing of the idealist system, this case against epistemology or method as the recourse to the simplest and most abstract, as the very first and most original thing, is presented superbly and very drastically by Hegel. Incidentally, when I said that capitalism is complicated and that it is wrong to view capitalism as a very simple model and take this simple model as one's point of departure, there is a certain contradiction between this and Marx's procedure, which, as many of you will know, proceeds from a relatively basic and relatively simple analysis, namely an analysis of the exchange relationship, and tries to elaborate not only the totality of economy from this analysis but even the totality of the social context, which also means power structures. But, ladies and gentlemen, Marx does not actually make things as simple as those people who read only the first volume of Capital, and I suspect that this still applies to most readers of Marx might think. My former teacher Grossman V described the Marxian method, and I think he was quite accurate in philological terms, as a method of progressive differentiation or progressive self-correction, and this has the exact meaning that ultimately the categories of circulating capital, the circulation process and the overall process of capital also feed back into the categories of capital production, into the capitalist production process. If we just consider for 1 second this aspect of the Marxian procedure epistemologically or philosophically, that is, from the perspective of a theory of society, then this means something very similar to what I have just explained to you with reference to didactics. It means this theory recognizes that what begins at the simplest level for purposes of representation is not actually the absolute first thing, for if the precondition for the whole of capital, a precondition that Marx asserts with an almost dogmatic and violent severity in many of his texts, is that the phenomena within the sphere of production are the key to everything else. For example, the key to all the processes one conventionally assigns to the sphere of competition and which vulgar economics, unlike that of Marx, considers the primary sphere. Then the upshot of this correction, if you apply what I have told you today, is that the first and simplest elements are in reality not the first at all. For if this first element, the process of production, is itself affected by the complicated processes detailed in the second and third volumes, then this is where the character of a kind of prima philosophia or system necessarily ends. So, in Marx, we certainly also find this aspect that one cannot deduce the entire world from exchange, as with some naive scientific method, and is taught beyond the eastern border, in a very simple and obvious systematic approach. When I speak of what is taught in the East, by the way, I am still being too optimistic. As far as I can tell, the precedence of the production process is not taught properly at all, and what is left of Marx are really just bits and pieces in a way that beggars belief. But that is just an aside. But now I would like to say that there is something unsatisfying about this methodological situation in Marx that I have just described to you, a certain ambivalence, for naturally one cannot see why Marx initially preaches the existence of a first thing, a key thing, and then modifies it afterwards. In doing so, and this applies to the whole structure of the Marxian system, if I can just apply this term to Marx, he made a concession to the prevailing scientific logic of his time, as it were, by supporting a unified method that proceeds from the simple to the complex, and when he said that he had toyed with a dialectical method, he had actually toyed too little, not too much, something that one often finds in the world. That is, he did not go nearly far enough, otherwise he would not have presented next to each other in so disconnected a manner this entirely logical and pre-dialectical view, on the one hand, using primitive categories from which everything else is elaborated by deduction, and a correction after the fact, on the other. Instead, he should have combined these categories from the start in such a way that they would also have been dialectical in the sense that this absolute primacy of the sphere of production would have come to an end, though no doubt this would have greatly impaired the political effectiveness of the theory, which was meant to be a theodicy of the proletariat, after all, or at least became that. So that is what I want to say about the structural question, as it were, in the theoretical model one finds in Marx. I would say that the concept of methodology we have treated here, as it generally manifests itself today, is turned on its head in the sense that it actually no longer reaches the things themselves, not least because it defers things ad infinitum and always says, well, we haven't got that far yet, we can't do that yet. It is always put off, and supposedly it will happen one day. But after 150 years of this postponement, which is already codified in Kant, no sensible person can believe that this kind of scientific concept formation will ever catch up. On the other hand, however, this primacy of method is something in its own right within the actual practice of empirical social science has an extremely harmful consequence today, one I wish to point out to you, and which is also acknowledged by the more perceptive empirical sociologists in America. Namely that the choice of topics for study, and the nature of the studies themselves, is based on the availability of methods, and that the methodological interest, that is, the interest in proving or disproving the utility of a method and possibly differentiating the method from one's interest in the substance of what one is trying to understand, namely society, takes very clear precedence. This, incidentally, is why, in America, countless empirical studies are duplicated and carried out again and again with slightly different instruments, and if there is a certain merit in the good old book The Authoritarian Personality within the whole of empirical social research, it was undoubtedly that, although it insisted very energetically on a particular methodological perspective, it was guided more by an interest in the matter that was apparent there, namely the connection between character structure and social structure, rather than being sworn purely to its method. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is the practical consequence, as it were, of the cult of the method per se. Let me add that the concept of method, especially in the field of the social sciences, has two different meanings that you would do well to keep apart for now. Methodology in German social science corresponds roughly to what you will find gathered together in the volume of Max Weber's writings on scientific theory, 7 namely mindsets that could, in a perhaps science organizational way, be described as a special form of epistemology, one that no longer keeps to the highest generalities of the so-called constitutive problems of objects as such but, rather, focuses on the constitutive questions or epistemological questions of the knowability of objects in a particular area, an objectively constituted area, such as interpersonal behavior and all the other things examined in traditional sociology. On the other hand, there is also, how should I put it, an epistemological practical understanding of methodology that is especially developed in America. If someone in America, while discussing a study, asks, "What is your methodology?" then what they mean is actually, "What is your method?" That is, they really mean, "How do you go about?" How do you start the whole thing? How do you proceed? So this second understanding of methodology could perhaps be termed the technological understanding of methodology, which focuses on the know-how, the aspect of, how can I learn something, how can I find something out? It is interesting that, in American sociology in particular, which is seemingly so empirical and so down-to-earth, so terra a terra, this second understanding has attained such a strange preponderance. One of the most famous empirical social researchers in America, really one of the most famous, if not the most famous, once told me in conversation that, as a sociologist, he was not really interested in any specific object, only in how one finds something out. I think it would be impossible to formulate a more damning critique of purely methodologically oriented thinking than this statement, for it admits that it is concerned only with the techniques and not really with the matter itself. And I think that this statement, whose authenticity I can vouch for, actually relieves me of the entire critique I have carried out for you if you have understood it correctly after my analysis. But I will say, for the sake of fairness, that the two conceptions of methodology which I distinguished from each other for the sake of clarification, specifically with reference to sociology, in fact have extremely similar results. In both cases, the method dictates the matter and not vice versa. For when Max Weber measures the various facts against the ideal type, then the mere fact of this, and of the incredible weight that this methodological application of ideal types gains for him, the adequacy or inadequacy of the facts in relation to the respective ideal type really becomes more important than an insight into the facts themselves. Then it is really more a matter of whether they align correctly with their ideal type, and not what the actual nature of the structures is. So the verbal definitions assert their precedence, although one hears time and again that they are only definitions and arbitrary designations, over insight into the internal laws of the matter itself. Actually, a thinker like Max Weber would most probably have denied that such internal laws exist in the first place. I would add that the meaning of method naturally varies historically, and the method which emerged in the time of Bacon and Descartes, the gradual and internally regulated process of insight, was naturally immensely productive but, like all aspects in the fabric of the bourgeois process of production, has meanwhile become a fetish in itself, which means that its function today is completely different from what it was 350 years ago. But more on this next time.